The discussion today is the future of sustainable farming animal-free? And the debate today marks the launch of an exciting new section of Viva, Viva Farming. So I thought before we actually go any further, we could do a little toast, which is why I've got this sat by me. I don't normally have some Prosecco sat by me at all. But I just thought, join with all the panellists here today to say thank you so much for coming and marking this. And Viva, Viva Farming! So many of you will know I founded Viva 28 years ago now. And in that time, we've researched, we've investigated, we've campaigned on food issues. And although undoubtedly there's been a real revolution in the way people view veganism, and of course in the demand and the provision for vegan foods, which has grown with incredible speed, especially in the last handful of years, still the issues surrounding how and what food is produced in the UK and beyond are becoming more pressing and more grave. Whatever side we may see ourselves on, nothing changes the environmental facts and the state of the world today. Whatever side we may see ourselves on, nothing changed the fact that we really need to collaborate and to improve the current dire situation. I'm sure the panellists will be touching on several of the issues, so I'll just mention one, which is particularly desperate and truly needs our joint help in averting disaster. 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction, many within decades, and more than before ever in human history. This was the stark conclusion reached in 2019 by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, comprising of over 130 countries, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, including the UK, the US, Russia, and China. This is serious, folks. Many scientists now are saying that the most serious aspect of the environmental crisis is this loss of biodiversity, the other living things with whom we share our planet. The huge loss, they say, represents a crisis that could surpass even climate change. They describe the huge losses we are seeing as biological annihilation. The human appetite for meat, fish, and dairy has come at a high price. Other scientists have studied the environmental impact of meat, fish, and dairy products. In a nutshell, basically they found that they far exceed that of plant foods. So the environmental costs of animal agriculture far exceeds that of plant foods. Meat and dairy using up over 80%, well over 80% of the world's farmland, and contributing almost 60% of the food's different emissions, but only providing just over a third of the protein we eat and less than a fifth of the calories we eat. And that comes from Joseph Poor's study at Oxford University. A study published in the journal Science of the Total Environment revealed how livestock production is pushing the expansion of grazing and animal feed cropland into areas of the highest biological biodiversity. In other words, we're running out of wildernesses. They recommend that people reduce their consumption of animal foods, replace them with more sustainable plant foods, their words, not mine, and say a future with a lower demand for meat, fish, eggs and dairy would drastically reduce habitat and biodiversity loss, fossil fuel energy use, greenhouse gas emissions and pollution, while still providing a nutritious diet that ironically would greatly improve global health. The current trends in food production and consumption are also considered unsustainable. The world's population, as I'm sure you all know, is expected to increase by 2 billion in the next 3 decades. That's according to the United Nations. Just satisfying, then, the expected human food and animal feed demands would require increasing global food production by 70%. Intensification with increased resource use simply will not produce enough to meet the huge demand. We have to find a different way to achieve global food security without expanding crop and pasture land and without increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And my argument being, the only real way that we can do that sustainably is to be animal-free. Viva, as you know, has worked hard to increase the number of vegans in the UK, and we're also based in Poland, and to ensure the demand and provision of vegan foods has exploded, but it's not enough. It is in all of our interest to collaborate, wherever you are on that line, that journey, and the main aim of Viva Farming is to help farmers transition to plant-based farming, but it's also to encourage new people, young people, into plant-based farming. We hope we can create collaborations that create much greater food security and food self-sufficiency in the UK. It still staggers me every time I think about it that less than 3% of UK cropland is used to grow fruit and vegetables. It's insane. If we expand on this, even modestly, we can significantly increase UK food production. We can help protect public health, not least reducing the chances of future pandemics. We can help to mitigate climate change. We can optimise land use for planetary health. We can restore ecosystems and biodiversity. We can prepare farmers for a healthy future where they're not threatened by advances in biotechnology. We can reduce or end factory farming and all its inherent cruelty. We can work towards a vibrant, sustainable Britain where farmers are celebrated and appreciated. Collaboration and working together to build a food system fit for the future is key if we protect planet Earth going forward. Viva Farming is all about building those strong relationships which see everyone working together to achieve this. And like you, I'm keen to hear the panellists' vision of sustainable farming and how we can work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Julia and to Viva for organising this and for these new name tags. So you've been asking my name. I'm Matt Broomfield, I'm a journalist. I'll be chairing the discussion today. I think that was a great overview of how serious, how wide-ranging, how universal these issues are, so I'm not going to say much more, particularly because we have such a stacked panel of experts. I would kind of say only this: my interest in these issues stems from the time I spent in Syrian Kurdistan over the past several years, whereas you may or may not be aware, the local administration places a very serious importance on taking an ecological approach and finding sustainable alternatives to the traditional agriculture and the traditional approach in that region that's been imposed there by some of the governments in that region for a very long time. And I think, these are issues that probably a lot of us in this room think are very serious. They're issues that remain for a lot of people quite academic, quite abstract, but that's not the case. As we all know, these are issues of life and death, and somewhere like Syrian Kurdistan, you see that happening on the ground day to day, how these issues really affect people's lives, how urgent it is. And you also see the difficulties between the ideals that one might have and the goals that one might have and the barriers that are placed in front of them by political culture, by governmental approaches, by societal attitudes and so on and so on. So I think the kind of seriousness with which I saw these issues being grappled with is something that we are going to experience more and more in this country, even more than we do already. But as I say, we have such a wonderful selection of experts here that we really want to hear from them. The kind of format, in theory, we have an hour and we have 9 wonderful speakers. I've been asked to ask them to keep their contributions to 4 minutes each. I'm sure that will happen and we will all be out of here and quaffing Prosecco by 6:05. So we will try to move quickly through the contributions, and I think, as Juliet was saying, it's very much not a case of vegans to the left of me, farmers to the right of me, or something like that. Everyone here is very concerned with these issues and has a great depth of expertise that they will bring. So we'll hear from everyone for a few minutes each, and hopefully there will be time for some kind of question and answer, some discussion at the end. So that being said, we'll go to the first speaker for the proposition, who will be putting forward the argument that the future of sustainable farming is indeed animal-free. We'll be hearing from someone else who works for Viva, from Kerri Waters, who has both kind of political and practical experience as a political coordinator, as a spokesperson for Animal Rebellion, who's also writing a PhD on the issues in question. So Kerri, if you'd like to introduce the motion, we'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Okay, so the motion today is the future of sustainable farming animal-free? So my name is Kerri. My interest in farming started when I worked at the Rural Payments Agency paying farmers when I was an undergraduate. Despite the sheer administrative incompetence, and I have some very eye-opening stories of that, the joy that I got from hearing from farmers and letting them know when their payments would arrive was actually overshadowed by the stories of despair and often, unfortunately, frequent threats of suicide due to the burden that the modern farming system put on them. When I left the Rural Payments Agency, I volunteered at the Museum of English Rural Life, where I archived images from farming from pre-World War II. And I was struck by the stark contrast between that rural idyll that I saw in those images and what's actually happening today with modern farming. And that's what my main argument is here today. Factory farming. Factory farming is the majority in this country. 85% of all farmed animals are farmed in these systems. And the farmers here today on the panel represent the minority, not the majority. Factory farming exists for a reason. We simply wouldn't be able to meet the global demand for meat and dairy without it. Without factory farming, prices would inevitably rise. We would need more land and more resources. I question whether alternative forms of animal agriculture, regenerative grazing, organic, grass-fed, there are many terms, is sustainable and scalable given the rising global population. As for the carbon sequestration ability of grazing animals, and that means to lock the carbon in the soil essentially, the jury's still out on that. The science is unclear. According to an Oxford study, the contribution of grazing ruminants to soil carbon sequestration is small, time-limited, reversible, and substantially outweighed by the greenhouse gas emissions they generate. And just to add that a recent World Wildlife Fund and Tesco report for the Oxford Farming Conference labelled grazing management, the science involved in that for carbon sequestration, as uncertain. I ask the question, should we be comparing regenerative grazing with the current paradigm of industrial farming, or should we be comparing it to the potential of veganic systems and rewilding? Another issue is land. Land is a finite resource. 85% of land in this country, farmland, is used to raise animals, and we only get 32% of our calories from that. If we were to universalise one of the gold standard versions of regenerative grazing, the NEPA state, much of that in the UK, we would need to reduce meat consumption by about 99.5% according to George Monbiot. Another example is white oak pastures in America. It requires 2.5 times more land than industrial systems. It's quite scary to think that we would need even more land than we currently do use. It's also unthinkable given that half the land used to grow food for the UK population is located abroad. We don't have food security in this country. We import 48% of all our food. The question shouldn't be whether animal farming is sustainable, but is it just? Is it just for a global population? Is it just for the environment, for farmers, for animals, for consumers? How fair is it to concentrate our resources on producing a product that the average family can't afford? How fair is it to concentrate the debate on making animal ag sustainable when we could be diverting funds into training, resources to help farmers move into alternative proteins, fruit and veg, and carbon capture? Disruption is coming to the industry. There's going to be a massive shake-up, more than the last 50 years when we cut subsidies. The mental health of farmers is in rapid decline. Prices are decreasing. The supermarkets have control of the entire food supply chain. And the income of the average farmer is only £20,000 a year. This is an absolute scandal when you think these are the people who are producing the thing that we vitally need to survive. They deserve better than this. And that can be better. We can do things differently. According to a Harvard 2019 study, we can move to a plant-based food system because most grazing occurs on pastures that would return to forests. We could slow down our carbon emissions and we could still grow enough protein using fava beans, split peas, chickpeas, etc. There's always been resistance to change. I'm not here to further that resistance, but to focus on our common ground and the values we share. Just because we have different visions doesn't mean we can't do that. In fact, the very future of our children and grandchildren depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that and for opening up some of, I suppose, the human aspects and of these governmental policies as they're playing out in our country today and how great the situation is here as well. We're now going to move on to hear the opening arguments from the opposition. So we'll rotate this microphone gently to the right. We'll hear from Caroline Drummond, who's been awarded an MBE for her work in this field, for running LEAF, the Linking Environment and Farming, farming environmental charity, since 1991, and working in the development of sustainable food and agriculture for many decades. Caroline, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for inviting me, because what an opportunity. And there are many, I kind of feel when it comes to opposition, I feel there are many synergies in terms of what's just been said. However, I think there are also some truths about what's happening on the ground. You talk about 85% of farming is down to factory farming. Clever words, industrial farming. The reality is no. The majority of our farmers are actually grass-fed livestock systems, particularly for beef and dairy. We're increasingly looking at supporting regenerative aspects. What's so important is that we really start driving much more around understanding better ways of doing things. So for us at LEAF, for the last 30 years, we've been talking very much around trying to define what are the 3 levels of sustainable agriculture. Economic viability is absolutely critical, as has just been highlighted. This is about providing systems that can support investment to really make things more acceptable and make things better. The second is the enhancement of our environment. These really, it sticks for everybody, what Julia was saying in terms of the 1 million plant and animal species that are threatened because of our activities as people. Which is not just in terms of how we farm, but it's through other things that we do, whether it be through transport or whether it be through housing, etc. And I think there are some real challenges in terms of truly understanding how we work with nature to have much more effective and resilient and robust farming systems to combat against things like climatic change. And of course, the third area of sustainability being around socially acceptable. For us, integrated farm management looks at more holistic approaches. Farmers don't work on single issues. They are constantly like some juggler at a circus, looking at soil management, crop health, energy use, pollution control, animal welfare and well-being, right through to nature improvement, waste management, and there are significant challenges around the waste, that we have sufficient food to feed 14 billion people if we were much more smarter in terms of what we reduced in our waste areas. And of course, on top of that, social engagement. It's site-specific and it balances the importance of really trying to understand where livestock fit within a viable farming system. Yes, in terms of where our grasslands, particularly here in the UK, and our focus here in the UK, they are good in terms of what they deliver from a biodiversity perspective, whether it be the dung beetle, whether it be the hedgerows, whether it be even the stone walls, which are rich in lichens and in terms of biodiversity there, or whether it actually be in terms of the diverse grassland systems, which are not only important for the 4 stomachs within a cow or a sheep, but are also critical in terms of maintaining our resilience against some of the biggest challenges of our ecosystem services. So when it comes to more regenerative approaches, nature-based solutions, and indeed really trying to look at the attention to detail of where biodiversity has an active part, that is increasingly important. We are seeing a radical change within our farming sector, where the historic issues around physical and chemical challenges are actually increasingly being replaced by better biological systems. And I think, we would all say hurrah to that type of approach. In terms of the other areas, of course, plant health is very important. Grassland is an excellent sequester of carbons. And yes, trees are, but our woodlands, in the last storm that we had up in Scotland, over 50% of what would usually be felled on an annual basis of our trees were knocked over in just one day. So we're suffering from ash dieback, and when you look at the real challenges around pests and diseases, woodland areas are really a big challenge. And whilst we would all love to plant more trees, we've also got to manage those trees effectively. And there are really, agroforestry and things like that have been a really important part. And of course, the fertility to our land. Manures from cows, from sheep, and in terms of, indeed, even ourselves, is going to become increasingly important to build the heart and the spirit of the biology that is resting within our soil. When it comes to really that activity, we forget how alive our soil is. And of course, when it comes to home-produced proteins, again, I think we'd all put our hands up to that. But this year and last year were perhaps two of the hardest years for the farmers that we work with that are growing peas and beans, because of the establishment were increasingly big challenges in terms of our climate, unforeseen weather circumstances, and I think as we really try and drive to bring and introduce new protein crops, we will need the breeding, we will need the infrastructure, we will need the machinery, and of course we will need the knowledge and skills to do that. But we're, this is a slow burn, because we've been trying this for the last, 10, 20 years. So we've got to make sure that we keep on that balance and keep on that infrastructure. And finally, when it comes to social and the importance of things like tourism and indeed rural employment, the livestock sector is supporting a huge infrastructure within our rural areas that many of which is not seen. And I think it's very important that if we take the livestock, we recognise if we take livestock out of such systems, then actually it doesn't bring the heart to those villages. It's good for tourism, and of course it's good for really our rural employment. I think our other big challenge that perhaps we need to make sure that we recognise is our own health. Livestock are critical we have an increasingly growing challenge around non-communicable diseases, but also coming up on the right-hand side of those diseases around things like osteoporosis, fertility challenges, because we are not getting the sufficient nutrients and minerals that are required in this area, particularly obviously iron, B12 and calcium and vitamin D3. And much of vegan products, of course, are ultra-processed, so the more that we can ensure and encourage that, then it's really important.
And I think we can now go straight on to hear from someone with a lot of experience of what it means to be a farmer on the ground in this country today, and indeed the last 30 years, Ian Tolhurst, the owner and the main driving force behind Tolhurst Organic, one of the leading organic farms in the UK, the first farm in the world to attain the stock-free organic symbol back in 2004. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you. I started my farming career when I was just 20 years old, as a means of finding somewhere to live, actually. I was employed on a very large dairy farm with 160 cows, which in those days, way back in the 70s, was a seriously big herd of cows. During my 4 years there, I learned an awful lot about agriculture. One of the things I did learn was that it's not the type of agriculture I wanted to follow, despite the fact that animals were well looked after, they were cared for. The dairy cow is the hardest work of all animals, but also the dairy farmer is the hardest work of all animals. It's a grueling job, really. So I decided not to go down that route. So it taught me a lot about agriculture and the type of agriculture I didn't want to get involved in. I learned a great deal about how much land it takes to support animals. I had no idea. I came from a complete non-farming background. I left school at 15. I didn't have an education, so I was badly equipped to understand some of these issues. But clearly, this farm was running on nitrogen, diesel, and cattle cake. And to me, this seemed to be completely wrong. I couldn't see the sense in this at all. The land was dead, there was no earth around, there was nothing happening. So I chose a different route. And the other thing which I've since become more aware of, I wasn't aware at the time, is the amount of ghost acres that go into supporting these farms. Half the protein was coming from half around the world. Even back in the 70s, the protein was coming a long way. Now, I'm talking about a relatively extreme form of animal agriculture, and then none of our table here. done anything of that type at all. But this is the extreme which we are still left with. And despite the fact that grass-fed may well be in some people's eyes really good, there's still a huge swathe of the UK supporting the dairy industry, which is massive. It really is. On my way up here today on the very slow and rather late train, I was looking out the window as one does, and I was actually looking for livestock. Now it's quite incredible. I came all the way from Reading to Birmingham and only saw one field with any animals in. Well, okay, it's winter, but where are they? Well, they're all indoors. Of course they're all indoors. They're all in buildings which they would prefer not to be in. The only animals I saw were, I think they looked like sort of pet sheep. There was about half a dozen outside someone's back door, and that was it. The land was empty of animals, empty of people. I didn't see a single person anywhere. What I did see was a huge swathes of moderately good agricultural land in cereals, of which more than 2/3 goes into feeding the animals that are present in the buildings that I didn't see. So it takes up a huge amount of land. And it's clear from all the major reports that have come out in the last few years, there's been lots. We have to reduce the amount of livestock production globally. There's no question. I think there are very few people that argue against that. I don't think probably anybody on this planet would say that's not true. We have to reduce the input of food and land into livestock production. As livestock numbers on farm will steadily decrease, they are decreasing now. I mean, this is already happening, but as they continue to decrease, we need to think about other forms of agriculture and how we're going to replace some of this livestock. I see this as a wonderful opportunity for farmers. This is an amazing opportunity for farmers. First time since the war, something really different could happen. We could be growing food for people. Juliet's figure about 3% land in horticulture, I think, is not quite right, because it's actually less than 1%. We could double that. We could be growing food and fibre and a whole range of products which we haven't even started to produce. We need to look back, and I don't know how this has been forgotten, we need to go back 80 years to what happened to farming in the wartime period. We went from 35% self-sufficiency, even worse than today, in 1935, from 35% self-sufficiency to over 90% in the space of 3 years. This is a major achievement, which I think has been largely unrecognised in terms of the effort that farmers put in and the effort that was driven primarily from the Ministry of Food. We need them back, we need the Ministry of Food back. And the way farmers responded to that was really positive. Okay, not everybody got what they wanted to eat, but they got what was a really good diet. And arguably, people during that period of time were far better in terms of health. The land was in far better condition, and everything was a whole lot rosier. So, if we're going to look at a new form of agriculture, which in my mind is going to be massively reduced in livestock, where does the fertility come from? Well, I've demonstrated over more than 3 decades. It's not a problem. We do not have to have manure on land to produce crops. It's completely non-needed. We do not need it. I've demonstrated that. We're growing the most high value, the most difficult crops we can do, fruits and vegetables, without any livestock inputs at all. We've done it through a system of green manures and fertility burden through trees. We have a lot of trees on the farm, we have agroforestry. So we know, and many, many scientists have been to our farm, they've monitored what we do, and we know that this works long term. So we don't need livestock for fertility. We can manage without quite nicely, thank you very much. So what's going to happen to farms in the future? Well, a lot of them will go back to rewilding. Some of them will go back to rewilding. Huge swathes of land which are presently growing industrial crops for intensive livestock production will go into rewilding, into trees, into alternative crops, and keeping people back on the land. One of the things we have to do is get more people back on the land. The farming population has been absolutely cut in the most dramatic way in the last 40, 50 years, and we need to get people back on the land. So I see a future which includes a lot of people on the land. There'll still be some animals. Believe me, it's not going to, no one's going to go vegan overnight. We're not going to change the whole world. We'd love to, but it's not going to happen. It's going to be a gradual process, but there will be people who are engaged in the land in terms of production, producing what is needed. So more people back on the land, less animal production by a huge factor, and a hugely better environment. We have to replace all the biodiversity we've trashed in the last 50 years.
Yes.
Thank you so much to Ian for sharing both his expertise and his own experiences. We will now hear for the opposition from someone else with first-hand experience of running and operating a farm, Richard Young, who is an organic 100% grass-fed cattle and sheep farmer in Cotswolds, together with his sister, but is also a technical expert on some of these issues. He's chairman of the Soil Growers Symbol Committee and the past editor of the journal New Farmer and Grower. Richard, thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I just want to say, first of all, that I read Juliet's book, The Ark, more than 20 years ago, and immediately recognised a kindred spirit. And almost all the things that she wrote about in there, about the boring and unsatisfactory lives of farm animals, immediately registered with me, because it's what I was feeling myself, and it was one of the reasons that I stopped using livestock markets and we changed to becoming an organic farmer from having been an intensive farmer when I first started farming. There are some huge problems in agriculture, and I'm just as much against factory farming as I'm sure all of you are. The problem for me is that if we move to a world where we don't use any animals at all, I believe it will make it less sustainable rather than more sustainable. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, in the UK, 2/3 of our farmland is in grass, and most, perhaps not quite all, but most of that is only really suitable for grass. Believe me, farmers would much prefer to grow crops if they can. They're easier, you can go on holiday in the winter, you don't have the problems of calving cows or lambing sheep in the middle of the night, and generally you make more money. And even on my farm, which is right on the steep slope of the Cotswolds, the scarp slope of the Cotswolds, where you can't plough much, there's evidence that in the past farmers have tried to grow crops on there and they've given up because they weren't very successfully. Also, a large part of the country, the UK, doesn't have the right sort of climate for harvesting during the summer. So I feel that we have to make use of our best natural resource in this country, which is grass. Grass grows better in the UK than almost anywhere else in the world, apart from perhaps Ireland and New Zealand. Crops can only be grown in a small part of the country, really. Now, there are a lot of reasons why I feel that, that I agree with all of you, and Juliet and your speakers here. Meat consumption is rising globally, and it's completely unsustainable. So I personally believe, and the organisation I work for believes, that there needs to be a dramatic reduction in meat consumption. But whereas most people point to cattle and sheep as the animals that they want to see reduced because they produce methane, our view is that the ones that we not need to get rid of are the ones that have been fed on grain and soya. And that's intensive cheap chicken and pork, and that we should all be I've got nothing wrong. I totally respect the right of people who don't want to eat meat, not to eat meat. But for the vast majority of us, I feel that we should all eat a small amount of really well-produced grass-fed meat, and that would be quite healthy. And we need to do an awful lot of things to make the system more humane. And as those of you who may have watched the Panorama programme a couple of weeks ago will have noted, there are, apart from the fact that we have animals that have boring and unsatisfactory lives, which I personally feel that there's no logical scientific explanation for this, I personally believe leads to a population of boring and unhappy people. There is actually still occasionally some direct cruelty on farms, and that needs to be stamped out. And the farming industry is united in condemning what's found on that farm. And I also feel I should actually pay credit to those campaigners, their courage and their ingenuity for uncovering that. And I hope that if there's any more farmers out there doing the same thing, they'll be exposed in a similar way. One other thing which is really, really important, which is often not thought about, is the fact that grassland generally, apart from some of the worst intensive dairy farms, contains clover and other legumes. Now, pollinating insects, and even things like bees and moths, which are disappearing in large quantities, which are important pollinators in their own right, as well as being part of our culture, they have a bonanza of food in the spring when there's obviously great crops flowering and there's hedgerow flowers and orchards are in flower. But come to the middle of the summer and there's nothing. And what they turn to traditionally at that time of year is grassland, where there will be a few weeds, a few buttercups and things like that with some nectar, but also where there'll be, particularly on organic farms and farms that are having the sense to use legumes, there will be abundant nectar at that time of year, and you stop those bees from starving. Honeybees can be moved by beekeepers and fed sugar, which I'm sure is bad for them, but our wild pollinators, and we've got over 200 species of bumblebees, 6 of which have gone into extinction in the last few years. Some of them have a range of a few hundred yards. And if they can't find food within that range, then they die out. Another thing I want to just mention is that there's a really important study which was co-authored by people like Tara Garnett and Ellen Roos and Pierre Gerber, who was one of the lead scientists behind the Livestock Shadow Report in 2006. They published a paper in 2018 which is arguing in the same way as me for big reductions in meat consumption overall. But they find in their analysis that if we move to a completely vegan diet and turn our back on the meat and milk that can be produced on our grasslands, we'd end up globally requiring 25% more arable land than we currently use at the moment. So it's not as simple as some people like to think. An aspect I just want to mention is that just think about palm oil. Over the last, you've all been told that vegetable oils are the healthy oils and animal fats are unhealthy. And part of that, I can tell you, has been the vegetable oil industry influencing some of the studies that have been produced. But just rather than look at all vegetable oils, which is a very complex issue, just think about palm oil. It's replaced beef fat in our diets over the last few years as we've moved away from natural foods to processed foods. And palm oil is 50% saturated fat, just the same as beef fat. And it contains no omega-3 fatty acids, which are the really important fatty acids for our health, which there aren't enough of on this planet, which you can get from grass-fed meat. So my argument is, if even from a cruelty point of view, if you think about the orangutans that climb up the pole with their baby in their arms and survey the devastation of thousands of acres that have been burnt to clear the way for more palm oil, those animals are suffering more than animals kept on grass-fed farms that are taken to an abattoir not too far away and slaughtered humanely. And just briefly, I've got time to say one more thing. Some of you may say, but what about methane? And I totally admit that we need to reduce all greenhouse gases. And the livestock industry is working on ways to cut methane emissions from cattle and sheep. There is interesting research showing that some animals actually genetically have much lower emissions than others. And research going on in Scotland is actually trying to find ways to select from those so we breed a new population of cattle and sheep which have much lower methane emissions. But there's a big difference between the methane that comes from cattle and sheep, which contains, when it breaks down to carbon dioxide and water, which it does quite quickly, it doesn't put any extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because the carbon dioxide in their breath came from the plants that they eat, and those plants took it out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So they're simply recycling carbon dioxide, they're not adding to the burden of CO2 in the atmosphere. The methane that's released from fossil fuel emission extraction, which is at least as much as that globally that comes from ruminants, leaves additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the end of the day, because it's carbon dioxide that's been locked up for 400 million years since the great coniferous forests that led to the coal seams and the oil and things like that. And also net carbon zero is what we have to move towards. We've really got to stop putting extra carbon in the atmosphere. In terms of methane, because it breaks down quickly, we only need to reduce methane emissions by 1/3 of 1% every year for the next 10 years to get net methane zero. Now, it might be necessary to reduce it more than that because we've got such a huge environmental problem with global warming. But in terms of actually getting net methane zero, we don't have to stop emitting methane completely. We do have to stop emitting carbon dioxide completely. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Richard and for enabling us to segue a bit into the question, not only perhaps rightly as we've been thinking about particularly the human impact on our society, but also on the impact of the animals that we live with, on behalf of the opposition to this motion, which of course is the correct thing to do, and the kind of discussion we're here for. And we're now lucky to hear from, speaking for the proposition, someone who I'm sure will enable us to go a bit deeper into this question of how do the animals fit into this. Professor Andrew Wright is a professor of animal welfare and ethics at the University of Winchester, founding director of that university's Centre for Animal Welfare, and who has advocated on behalf of animals and their rights for decades. Andrew, thank you.
Thanks very much. We're here to talk about the sustainability of farming systems, and I think there have been some really good summaries so far from some of the speakers about the quite devastating environmental impacts on biodiversity of global livestock farming systems in terms of land use, deforestation, water use, water pollution, nitrogenous contamination of the land and waterways, and so on and so on. But sustainability is much more than just environmental sustainability. In order for farming practices to be truly sustainable, they need to produce produce which is affordable by consumers. It can be produced in a way which is profitable for producers and retailers, which is safe for the people working in those industries. And one example of the problem there is the animal slaughtering industry. It's one of the most hazardous industries to work in, high rates of injuries and so on. But in particular, it has to be an industry which matches evolving social values and concerns over time. Slavery is an example of an industry that once was economically quite profitable and viable. It became out of step with evolving social values at the time. It's no longer considered to be acceptable. It's no longer considered to have something called social license. It's considered to be permissible by most of society. With respect to animal farming, the vast majority of animals farmed today, indeed around about 85%, are intensively farmed. It's easy to see how true that is in a place like the United Kingdom, for example. I mean, simply need to consider roughly 900 million poultry out of around about 1 billion farmed animals overall. Of course, nearly all of those poultry are intensively farmed laying hens or meat chickens. Very easy to see whether that claim is true within the United Kingdom and also globally. So the vast majority of animals today are intensively farmed. That means that they're typically confined in fairly restricted spatial environments at high stocking densities, so they're crowded together with very large numbers of other animals, which interferes with normal social behaviours sometimes. The environments that they're in are also quite barren. They're quite deprived of opportunities for animals to exercise their highly motivated natural behaviours. Things like the needs to forage, to explore their environments, to manipulate materials within their environment, such as being the leaf litter of a forest floor for the ancestors of laying hens and meat chickens. So they're in environments which deny them the opportunities to fulfil probably most of their highly motivated behavioural urges, which are still there after many generations of being intensively farmed, and are very crowded. These environments are very stressful for the animals. That stress is quite profound, but it's also chronic over time. It's sustained over quite a long period of time. That is inhumane. That causes behavioural pathologies, particularly stereotypies. These are behavioural patterns which are repetitive, pretty much unvarying behavioural patterns which are believed to indicate distress, which is both profound and chronic over time. So we see that in intensively farmed animals, things like bar biting, sham chewing, head rolling, pacing, and other stereotypical behaviours. So we know these animals are suffering, they're stressed. This kind of treatment of these animals, and indeed the vast majority of the world's animals farmed today are kept in these sorts of conditions, is increasingly out of step with what's expected by society. More than 2/3 of consumers today are significantly or seriously concerned about animal welfare. On top of that, we've got what we do to the animals in terms of the husbandry procedures. Many of these animals are subjected to procedures such as beak trimming, tail docking, castration, branding, which are painful quite severely in the short term, but often also in the long term. And for economic reasons, painkillers are often not provided to these animals, which is, again, something that is really quite cruel. So these farming practices, unfortunately, are increasingly out of step with what is quite rightly expected by society today. And then finally, on top of all of that, we've got the value of these animals' lives themselves. Let's say there are animals which are extensively farmed, which don't have any of these environmental deprivations, which don't suffer any of these painful husbandry procedures. Even these animals eventually are likely to be loaded into trucks mixed with unfamiliar animals, subjected to a range of stresses, unfamiliar sights, sounds, locations, smells, trucked increasingly longer distances because small-scale slaughterhouses are closing down more and more across the country Two, the frightening environment of a modern slaughterhouse and being killed at a very premature stage of life. We now understand that animals' lives are intrinsically valuable, not just instrumentally in terms of what they can give us, but they're worth considering. They have value in their own rights. So I think the wholesale killing, we're talking of around about 80 billion land animals each year worldwide. That's 10 times the human population, not even thinking about the fish, which is many times more. The destruction of those lives, in most cases, not because of any deep need that we have for animal produce, but because of preferences that consumers have for animal produce, is increasingly going to be seen as unsustainable as well. So, thank you.
Andrew, as I suspected, time's winged chariot is hurrying near, so if the remaining 4 speakers can keep just about as brief as everyone else, that would be brilliant. We will now go over to someone else with a few contributions to make on the question of animals' rights and animals' roles in this question. Christopher Price, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Rare Breeds Survival Trust and has been heading up a business plan to support the UK's native animal breeds following Brexit. Christopher, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I'm in the rather happy position of being able to agree with pretty much everything the other side have said, while still being able to oppose them on the motion. The motion that we are supposed to be discussing is the future of sustainable farming animal-free? Well, I would say not, and for a very simple reason, in that it's not going to happen. No government is ever going to ban animal agriculture. It's just not in our lifetimes. The only other way it could happen is through market forces. People stop wanting to go and buy meat. That's not going to happen either. So I think, accept where we are, that for all the reasons we've heard, animal agriculture or farming in general have to change. How do we do that? And I think that's a rather more constructive approach to be taking, rather than some sort of absolutist, perfectionist type approach. No, I appreciate the sort of warm glow of feeling that you're on the side of the angels and all the rest of it, but that doesn't help the animals. Let's think about how we can improve that situation. So where do we start? Well, I assume that most people's interest in or concern over animal agriculture starts off with welfare. There's lots of other arguments, but I suspect most people come to it through welfare prism. What does welfare mean? Well, I think first of all, it's not the same as cruelty. Welfare is about the animal having the ability to express itself, to do what it would do, where the human's not involved, basically. So it's about feeling safe, it's about feeling fed, and it's about being able to engage in whatever social structure it chooses to, whether it's with a herd or whether it's individual. It's those sort of things we ought to be looking to facilitate. Before we started, I was flicking through some of the publications that were at the desk, and I'd say, I agree with pretty much everything that's in there. Okay. You condemn farrowing crates, quite rightly. Overuse of antibiotics, quite rightly. Now, all the right things are in there, and I would suggest we're much better off trying to work out or demanding that we only buy meat from people who comply with that sort of approach, who respect the welfare needs of the animals, who don't engage in some of the horrendous practices you rightly describe in these publications, and secure change that way. But we're talking about sustainability. Perhaps the next element of sustainability is economics. We're talking about farming as an industry or a business. People have to go and make money from it. And how can we encourage that from a more sustainable view? Well, I think if you start off by improving the welfare, then I suggest that some of the business sides get better as well. One of the biggest expenses for farmers under the current system is to think of all the input costs. We were just hearing about how intensive farming works. That requires a lot of kit to be built. They need to go and build big sheds to go and put the animals in. Once they're in there, because they're so confined, they don't have grass, so they have to have lots of supplementary feed, concentrates and the like. That's all expensive. Because they're so confined, they also tend to go and spread disease much more than they should. So your vet and med bills go up as well. All of the aspects of industrial farming put costs onto the farmer. If we can get away from that and farm in ways that don't impose those costs, then bottom line improves. On the other side of the equation, if we can find ways to help farmers charge a premium for their produce, the profit side goes up as well, the income side goes up. And that's things like celebrating the sort of things that consumers claim to want, like lower inputs, higher welfare, lower environmental footprint, and perhaps provenance and sense of place as well. All things can make it more attractive. So I suggest that you can make a business from this less but better type approach. Then we have the environmental element of sustainability. There's been a lot of talk about biodiversity, and I think it's worth remembering that livestock are part of biodiversity too. If you look at the Convention on Biodiversity, it doesn't limit biodiversity to just wild animals. Farmed animals, or agri-biodiversity as it's called, are part of it too. We have the same sort of obligation to go and conserve things. We've talked about extinctions earlier on. The last farm animal to go extinct before my organisation was formed was something called the Lincolnshire curly-coated pig, and you can still see pictures of them. They was only in the early 70s they disappeared, but they were these very quite big pigs, but they had woolly coats like sheep. Wonderful sort of things, and they were farmed animals, and now we've lost them. So yes, of course, beavers and seagulls and things matter. I would suggest some of our livestock have got some important qualities as well. We've talked about the environmental benefits of what animals do rather than just what they are, and I do take the point that the judge is out to some extent on climate matters and the soil management stuff. There's a lot of anecdote and not enough references on that point, so I think there is something in that. But in terms of delivering wider biodiversity, the habitats, the landscapes that we all cherish were largely created by livestock farming. The meadows are there because of the livestock. If we want to go and recreate those meadows, as we all say we do, then I would suggest using the right animals is the best way to go about it. And finally, under sustainability, there's the sort of social aspect of it. By that I mean, I guess, perhaps cultural would have been a better word. The White Park cow, which is a symbol of my organisation, first came to what is now Britain when Britain was still connected to mainland Europe. There was this doggerland that sort of went from the east coast of England round to the south. A huge landmass that disappeared about 4,000 years ago. But the first hunter-gatherers brought White Park cattle with them. They were here before Stonehenge was completed. The monks in Norman times kept the white cattle. The Druids in Anglesey kept white cattle. If you look back at some of the earliest Celtic stories in Ireland, they celebrate the white cattle. The point I'm making here is that these kept animals were part of our history, part of our culture. We celebrate them. They're just as important as our built heritage and our wildlife heritage, and we should be conserving them for very similar reasons. White Park may be an extreme example, but think of all the breeds that have some local connection. Tamworth pigs, Oxford Sandian blacks, they were created to go and meet particular needs in a particular area. They have a long, strong cultural resonance, which I think is something worth saving. So, how do we get there? Well, I would suggest recognise that, in fact, Kerri was saying, backtracking a moment, Kerri was saying that she used to work at the Merle, the Museum of Industrial Life, which is a wonderful place in Reading, much nicer than the RPA. If you visit there, you'll see pictures of some of these animals and breeds we've lost. Ian was talking about farming between the wars, when things were much more sustainable and generally everything was rather better. Try and get back to that sort of farming, low input, high value, eating much less meat. It is doable, and it's easy to vision. One of the slogans in my organisation that we use a lot is right breed, right place, right density. It ticks all the boxes. You're meeting the welfare needs, you're meeting the economic needs, and you're meeting the environmental needs. It's a far more constructive way, I would suggest, to go and to demand that farmers provide rather than opting out. In some sort of elitist, superior type perspective, which I'm afraid I associate with veganism. So, there you go.
Okay, thank you to Christopher. And one thing Christopher touched on there was some of the difficulties in seeking to achieve movement on this issue through political means, through lobbying, intractability around this issue. Someone with experience in this field is Yasmin Taboo, who will now speak for the proposition, who was, among other things, headed up the UK political party Animals Count, now the Animal Welfare Party, was CEO of the Vegan Society, and is now the Vice President of the Pro-Veg International Organisation. Jasmine, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to begin with the absolutist position that Christopher mentioned, I would propose that future farming is virtually animal-free, as we can rely on plant-based, fermented, and soon also cultured foods to nourish us and many more people. Just briefly touching on the health argument mentioned before, I'm not a GP, but this book is written by two medical professionals, actually cancer specialists, and answers all your questions about vegan or plant-based nutrition and health. So if anyone is interested, this is just one example of many books and studies out there. So meat is not necessarily the problem, but sadly the animal is. Well, actually the inefficient animal farming systems. Much of the food that the animals eat is not actually converted into edible meat, but it's used for bodily functions, to maintain the animal's bodily functions. And so we're actually wasting tons of animal feed that we could be eating ourselves. Eating plants directly rather than through passing them through cows, sheep, pigs and chickens first could feed up to 4 billion people extra. And this is still true for extensively grazed animals. It's always a conversion loss. I hear you, we don't eat grass, but much of the UK relies on important soya and grains, which directly contribute to the 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions caused by animal farming. And UK pasture-fed animals make up only a very, very small proportion. They take up so much land and cause relatively high methane and nitrous oxide emissions and ammonia that it would make much more sense to use that land for rewilding and increasing biodiversity, which is badly needed, as we've heard before. And we've also seen in the last 20 years that birds are disappearing due to intensive farming systems, and that's only going to increase. Farms also cause a lot of pollution to rivers. A socially just transition away from animal foods towards sustainable plant-based, fermented and cultured foods is essential. If we allow current consumption patterns to continue, the food system alone would take up about 95% of the remaining carbon budget to stay within the 2-degree limit within the next 80 years, leaving only 49 gigatons of carbon for all the other sectors combined. That's clearly not viable. And as most of the animal consumption in Western developed countries is happening here, we need to reduce by at least 70 or 80% in order to meet climate goals and allow for a fair food distribution globally. This would also help food security and lowers risks of future zoonotic outbreaks and pandemics, given that 3 out of 4 emerging diseases originated in animals. We should use land to grow crops more efficiently, and we've heard from Ian Tolhurst how to do this in harmony with nature. Other options include precision farming, vertical farming, and other technologies that increase yield and decrease land and water use and cause lower greenhouse gas emissions. The tiny Netherlands, where I'm from, is the second most densely populated country in the world, yet also the second largest exporter of agricultural products as land is used productively. Richard Young said that we can't grow many crops in the UK and that we need 25% more land for vegan diets. That's if you actually assume that all the food needs to be produced here. But we should remember that plant-based foods coming from afar usually have a lower carbon footprint than local animal produce. People may believe that food miles are more important, but pollution and emissions are mostly caused by ruminant and enteric fermentation, burping, farting, the manure and the land use changes. So a sustainable future includes plants, fungi, cultured foods and hybrid foods, including fermented products. Fermentation technology is increasingly receiving more investments. $435 million was invested in the first 7 months of 2020 alone, already a 60% increase compared to 2019. I've not yet seen the figures for 2021, but it's massively increasing. And encouragingly, well over a third of the British population are already flexitarians, vegetarians and vegans, so actively substituting their animal products for plant-based versions. And this is a permanent change in food habits because people are concerned about health and sustainability. So let's all work together to achieve this exciting, sustainable, virtually animal-free future where people choose delicious and healthy foods that are good for all people, animals, and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And we just have one speaker left from each side, and I'm really excited to hear from our final speaker of the opposition, Dr. Julia Wright. who's worked for over 30 years in the sector, and particularly on enabling communities to develop and respond and build new forms of food security in the aftermath of disasters, something which is very important. So, Julia, thank you.
So to start with a quote, and this is just to show that whoever's doing the research often comes up with the conclusions they want. So this particular report was done by the FAO in conjunction with a major organic research centre in Switzerland, and it was about to see if organic mixed farming can feed the world, so that's mixed farms. And they did some modelling, and they said that combinations of organic production area, a reduction in food waste, a transfer of feed producing to food producing activities on arable land, so using arable land to feed humans, not animals, coupled with greater use of nitrogen fixing legumes, can sustain the world's population in 2050 with no more than existing farmland, so don't need more farmland. So, I mean, you know, we hear lots of different bits of information depending on who's doing the research, and that's, I just wanted to put that out there because I find it confusing as well. But I've been working for decades on organic farming research in different countries and with farmers, all kinds of farmers, and I do eat meat. I eat wild meat, and I have organic or biodynamic meat and fish and everything else as well. And I've experimented with vegan diets and fruitarian and all those kinds of things, and my body works best with what's called high quality protein, and I find it difficult to live without that. And if you look at Ayurvedic medical systems from India or other types of older medical systems, not the Western ones, you will see that we have different body types, different physiologies, and we need different kinds of foodstuffs, and we need that diversity. It needs to be available for all of us, all right? So I'm not saying that everyone needs to eat meat just because I need to. You know, that's one of the things I found suits me. So I wanted to say that obviously we all agree that no one wants industrial farming, factory farming, this intensive farming. That can go for plant systems as well as arable, as well as livestock. If you look at what's happening with the almond plantations in California, it's disastrous for soil fertility, for the environment. And that where's that going? For almond milk that we're drinking? So we need to be looking at the whole food system and not just focusing on one side of it. You know, the whole mindset that created these intensive monocultures isn't doing us any good. So, you know, I think livestock do have, for me, an intrinsic place because they're in nature. In organic farming, we try to mimic or use biomimicry, so we try to copy natural systems. Animals exist throughout natural systems, and what we try and do is mimic that in a farming system in the best way possible. To remove them would actually be unnatural because they're cycling nutrients that we need. So one of my biggest concerns is about vegan foods and farming are the nutrients going into the crops? Because you know what the vegan farming system seems to be comparing, and I haven't found any research that's looking at this, is if you have manure or you'll have green waste, a vegan green waste, and you're using that for soil fertility, they're not like for like. They don't have the same constituents or components. How is that influencing the nutritional quality of the crop that's being produced? And that's a question I haven't found an answer to. I haven't seen any research on it. I'd be very interested if there is research going on, but I haven't seen one. So what I would say there, the jury's out. I'd say we need long-term trials to have a look at that and see what we're doing, because if we're reducing, our crop quality is already reduced in terms of mineral and vitamin content by up to 90% since post-war period. So we don't want to reduce the mineral and vitamin content anymore, but we need to increase it. But my overall idea, and this is like a vision for what could farming look like with livestock, and so I've kind of listed some of the things that I'd like to see. And this is drawing a lot from indigenous communities who eat meat, and they also have huge respect for every being thing, not living thing, not just animals, but plants as well, and minerals and everything, because for them everything holds consciousness. So what I would say is that we need respect and gratitude for all living things and developing an intimate relationship with animals on the farm, and allowing animals to express their full nature, which the speakers already talked about, and adapting the farm around that, and using the manure and fertility for nutritious crop growing rather than only, or it's more important than for meat. and that when animals are fed, they're fed with things that are appropriate for their digestive system, such as pasture-fed livestock. That we don't buy in feed onto the farm. We grow the feed which can be grown on the farm, and that balances out the head of livestock we can keep on it. That we don't do any mutilation of animals, which is ridiculous. But for example, cow's horns are usually cut off, but we retain the cow's horns. They're actually living organs for blood circulation. They use the horns to communicate with the rest of the herd. They use it for physical heat balance, for digestion and metabolism. So why? Anyway, I can't even think about it. Calves, lambs, and kids should be raised on the milk of the herd, not any substitute feeds. And as we talked before about slaughter, it should be dignified with an appreciation of the life and the sacrifice the animal has made. And in indigenous communities, they communicate with the animals before they hunt, and they ask if they can kill one. So there's a conscious relationship with that. Yeah, and you can laugh, but this is what they do. I mean, we might want, and this is what indigenous societies do, and we've lost that conscious communication. And I think that one of the biggest things we can do is to get our consciousness back and have a conscious relationship between plants as well as animals. And so all this list I just read out is what biodynamic farming systems already implement. So there is a food system out there, a farming system out there, which tries to be conscious and tries to connect with the rest of nature. And whether you only eat vegetables or not, meat or whatever it is, they're still farming systems that we need to support and buy products from, because they're trying to be more conscious. And I think that would go a long way. I think overall it's not about artificially banning animals from the farm simply because we're in a wrong relationship with them. We need to correct the relationship with the animals, and that's not about banning them. It's about developing a relationship with them and learning how to have a right relationship with them. And that does make sense from an indigenous perspective, even if our Western brains can't quite grasp it right now, but we're very far removed from all life from a spiritual perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia, for that very thoughtful perspective, very interesting perspective. We go now to our final contribution for the proposition from Rich Hardy, who has a background as a journalist in exposing, doing undercover work to expose animal cruelty in the global farming system, and now cares for the land on a community farm, vegan farm in Cornwall. Rich, thank you.
Nice to meet you all today. Yes, so I've been working for 2 decades undercover as an investigative journalist, documenting animal agriculture, essentially. It's taken me all around the world, over 100 assignments, 30 plus countries, and I've spent a lot of time working on slaughter lines in factory farms, and basically getting to grips with the whole system as it's currently being built. And to be honest, it's been like living on a horror film for 20 years. I've seen everything you can possibly imagine, which has not been good for animals, it's not been good for people, it's not been good for workers, and it's not been good for the planet. And I don't want to hit you with tons of stats and figures. I think we've probably heard a lot of those already today. I'd rather tell you some stories. And one of the stories that is really powerful and moving for me is that a few years ago, I was up in the north of Argentina, right up in what were the forests, very biodiverse, full of everything you can imagine in terms of flora and fauna. But when I arrived there, I found a little old lady called Ramona. She was living under a tarpaulin. Her house had been burnt to the ground. Her well water was poisoned. And that was done by the land grabbers. These were the land grabbers that wanted to plant soy on her land, the land that she'd used to feed herself, the land that she'd used to get all her medicines from herself, and she sat there under the tarpaulin all alone. The forest was decimated, and the planes were flying around the landscapes, dropping the chemicals onto the soy that was growing on the bare soil. And I took a few steps away from Ramona, and I found families that were overjoyed to see the soya growing as lush green plants on the edge of their villages, only to find several years later that their children were being born with birth defects, suffering from cancers, and dying, essentially. Their communities were dying because of the chemicals that they were being confronted with day in, day out. That soya wasn't being grown for them, it wasn't being grown for us. It was grown to put in the mouths of farm animals, Europe, the US. And I followed that consignment of soy back to Europe, back into the farms that are feeding the majority of our people, the factory farms. The farms were raising broiler chickens for meat, pigs, and it took me to places like Italy, where I picked up the tray again. And I visited a pig farm in Italy. It's one of those big, prestigious ham companies that we're all familiar with. I think it's lots of money from you as European Union citizens to support their artisanal marketing activities of hams being wrapped up in Tuscan sunsets as they hit the shelves of the supermarkets. And when I went into those places, I was confronted by cages, crates. I was confronted by the hacking coughs of pigs running up one aisle like a Mexican wave and back down the other. I was watching and looking at the workers, not just attending to sick animals, but racing to and from the pharmacies that they have on farms. Can you imagine? Some of these pharmacies are as big as the pharmacies that you go into week in, week out if you're suffering from a cold. They have them on site in factory farms. Now, the system of ours, our system of producing food, animal agriculture, is broken. We have to fix that. We must fix that. And we can fix it. And we can fix it because there's already people that have done this and showed there's another way. Ian, sitting next to me on my right, has been doing it 30, 40 years. He shows that you can grow food that is good for health, good for the environment, good for the plants. Not taking away all the nutrients. I mean, taking that nutrients from the Amazon and those forests of northern Argentina and putting it into the mouths of our animals, we're taking all those nutrients away from the Amazon, where the forests are being decimated, and we're spraying it and putting it onto land here, where it can quite easily run off and pollute our rivers if we're not careful. This is a system that's completely broken. We can't live with it anymore. And that's why I, as a journalist, is known to farming. I think it's possible to grow food without animals. And I've done 1 year of it already. I don't think we need trials. I don't think you need to be an expert. You can grow food in your own gardens if you have it. You can grow them on your balconies. I'm growing them in a 1 acre site. I'm involved in the community. I'm completely transparent about it. I'm inviting people to the farm. We've all got to be doing it.
Thank you so much to Rich for that very kind of lucid and first-hand account of both the evils of the system that we've been discussing in its worst form and what one can do about it. We are now coming to the end of our discussion, I suppose, kind of by way of conclusion. It may be good just to hear perhaps from not everyone again, unfortunately, but just from one person for the proposition, one person for the opposition. Any closing thoughts they have about the common ground that we might have for collaborating on this issue in the future, for the benefit of farmers, for the benefit of animals, for the benefit of people, and for the benefit of the environment in which we all live. How can push towards sustainability, push towards veganism work together?
Okay, maybe each person can say something really short.
If it's really short, then by all means.
Could I start as I just finished?
Sure.
Okay. I would also say that I'm not doing this with any of your money. Yes, I'd like some of your money to buy the vegetables, but I'm not doing it without subsidies. Take the subsidies away from animal farming, and it wouldn't be feasible.
Yeah, I'm also doing it about subsidy as well. The subsidy to our farm wouldn't make any difference. We can still make it work.
For common ground, I'd say concerns about animal welfare, conservation, species loss, and the intrinsic value of animals' lives. I think that people on all sides of the spectrum care about these matters, and if they think about that enough and learn about the issue and the facts, then it does all lead in the same direction, I would say. So I'd say that's the common ground principle we all share as our values.
I think what I've heard today is that there's consensus on reduction, and I think we at least need 70 to 99% reduction in meat consumption, and that would already make a massive difference to animals, the environment, our own health, etc. So that's where I see it as common ground.
I think
the most common ground I see is on factory farming. It would be useful if we had a working definition of what factory farming, a legal definition in this country, so we all know what we were talking about. And also the idea of bringing the consumer and the farmer closer so that everyone has a stake in the food system. I think we can all agree that that's essential because we just don't understand where our food comes from.
Yeah, yes, just to add, I think, better and less, but I think, yes, the connections of our food system is broken. I think there are so many cultural aspects, there are so many technical aspects, there's such an opportunity, but working together is going to be increasingly important.
I think my biggest take-home message, actually, there's an awful lot more that unites us here than divides us. And we've got a much bigger enemy against us, the agrochemical industry, those forces who are pushing to intensify agriculture further, which unfortunately is one of the things that's most likely to happen from the current changes in agriculture. They're being presented as green farming and sustainable farming. In fact, they're going to be very much the opposite if we're not careful. And I think we should try to work together. I spent most of my life trying to say everybody should be an organic farmer. I'm now recognising that was an unrealistic dream, but I'm trying to help move everyone in that direction. And why it might be difficult for you to give up the ideal of every farm becoming a vegan, moving away from livestock, you might perhaps take on board that you'd be better trying to promote some of the better systems and try to throw everything out at the same time.
Yes, I think there's a strong theme, isn't it? We all, I think, pretty much agree on what the problems are. But as someone else has said in a slightly different context, the issue isn't to understand the world, it's how to change it. And I think perhaps a bit more thought as to how we can produce a sort of farming which may not deliver everything we want, but delivers much more of what we want, is the more constructive way to go.
Yeah, I kind of agree, and I just really like this dialogue and thought, and makes it question what is life about as well, and what does compassion mean? Being compassionate, which I think we all feel we are, and yes, lots of deep questions. Thank you.
I just want to thank everybody for coming here today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and what we wanted to do here was to reach out to the farming community to actually start the opening of discussions between what has been pushed for many reasons to being one side or the other, where never the twain shall meet. And it's, we've been pushed towards, it's like vegans on one side and farmers are the enemy. And of course, farmers are providing our food. The human race has got this planet, this precious planet, into such a mess. The climate crisis, the threat of being in the sixth mass extinction, just as the starting points of major issues that we have to address. Surely to God, we can all at least come to some agreement that we have to massively reduce the amount of animal products that we're producing. Anyone who's seen Seaspiracy, just looking at the devastation of the oceans alone, the fact that 4/5 of the oceans are on the point of ecological collapse through overfishing. Wherever you look on this planet, whether it be the Amazon forest or where I've just been to Uganda, the precious wildlife, the few savannas that we have, which are so few now left in Africa, the pressure which I saw firsthand on livestock being put to reduce these landscapes even further. It's everywhere you go, every country that you look in. We have to, as the human race, develop some kind of compassion and understanding that for us to go forward and to protect this planet, first and foremost, we have to massively reduce the amount of animals that we are consuming. I think today illustrated that there's a lot of commonality between us. I think everybody agrees on the last goal that I've just said, which needs to be a massive reduction. If we can start with there and how we move forward in terms of the kind of visions of farming, so we can create more safe spaces like Ian has created, and some of our speakers on my right, the types of farming that some of them are talking about, you can see could so easily be adapted towards the vision that we all, that we all want to work towards. So I think the next kind of stage perhaps is actually producing that document, talking about the vision of what it is that we see and how, and then the major challenge of how we get there. Just that little thing. The point, I guess, I'm sort of like, saying a lot, but I've been campaigning on these issues for a very long time. You think about human history. I was working on vegetarianism. I was the first person in the UK to campaign on vegetarianism. Can you actually believe that? Because the organisations I worked for didn't campaign back then. And the changes that I've seen in such a short amount of time, whether or not you want vegetarianism, veganism, or massive reduction, the point is society is changing very rapidly indeed. We're aspiring to different goals. We go around speaking to universities, we specialise, we've got a section that talks to universities. People of those ages, they're ready to jump to veganism. They don't know all the ins and outs of the reasons, but the amount of support is now astonishing. Things are definitely changing big time. So it's about directing how we take all that goodwill and that understanding, that desire to not kill our planet and every species with us, how we take that positively and use that demand, especially from young people, to create something that's different. It has to be done, and this is, of course, just the starting point. But I feel a lot of hope from speaking with everybody today. There is a lot, goodwill, and I feel that we can work together, and we have to work together to create a better world. Thank you.
That's it, that in an age of polarisation, then collaboration is so important, discussions like this are so important, movement building is so important. The forces that are trying to run this world into the ground for their own profit are very organised, are very big, are very competent, and find ways to work together very well. And it's our duty, wherever we might stand on some of these issues here, to find a way forward. And so, for that reason, I would like to thank all of the speakers for their contributions from such a wide range of experiences, backgrounds, approaches. Thank you all for coming, for listening, for participating, and of course to Viva for organising the conversation. So thank you very much, and I'm sure there'll be a chance for further discussions afterwards and as we go on. Thank you.